Welcome to the video lecture series, Culture, Worldview, and Origins. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. This is the third part of the series, The Origin of Life, under or with the parameters of non-Western biblical. We're looking at biblical record and the biblical parameters, but acknowledging that those biblical parameters can be interpreted or have to be interpreted, and through that interpretation process, if the correct parameters or the correct rules for interpretation are not applied, you can come up with different interpretations. And that's why we've put on non-Western, because the original culture that produced these writings was a non-Western culture. And so trying to put those parameters of what is non-Western. Now, at the beginning of this lecture series, we went over culture, worldview, and origins. Culture, we went over 21 points of differences between a Western and a non-Western type of thinking. So you can go back and look at some of those differences and how those differences would influence the hermeneutics, which is the science of interpretation, interpreting the biblical record. And that's why we have often conflicting reports from different theologians, different pastors, different seminaries, different churches. They come up with conflicting interpretations, biblical interpretations. And why is because of the factors that are involved that Stephen Jay Gould went over in the beginning, is that culture, prejudice, theory, and habit all influence the perceiving process. And it's the same in theology. It's the same in understanding biblical parameters. Those four factors enter into the same interpretation process, the hermeneutics of it. So why do different churches exist or come up with different biblical interpretations? It's because of those factors, those four factors that Stephen Jay Gould has mentioned. So we're on the origin of life, but we're looking at it from a non-Western biblical perspective. And this is number 3. What we had seen before in number 2 series is that the spontaneous generation is a necessity to believe in, to hold on to, if one is to keep a closed system. A closed system meaning that there's no intervention, there's no God. There is nothing that comes in to interfere. So in other words, if we're going to keep a closed system, we have to figure out a way to generate life from non-life within that closed system. And what we looked at earlier was the competition by Louis Pasteur, in that he basically won the French Academy of Sciences competition of showing that spontaneous generation does not work, that life does not come from non-life. And then Engels, Frederick Engels, then replied, by these experiments alone, Louis Pasteur can never prove the impossibility of what we believe to be true. So in other words, it's a belief system, and we have to choose what to believe. So do I choose to believe in an open system? And if I do believe in an open system, then I submit to the authority of that system. And our Western tendency is to not want to submit. We are strong personalities. We are do it ourselves, independent, autonomous, and we want to be successful and understand and figure it out on our own. And that comes to even figuring out God, is that there's a lot of groups that no longer believe in an open system. The Christian groups that don't believe in an open system anymore, that it's a closed system. And if it's a closed system, then therefore the biblical revelation is not divine and was not inspired, because closed system you can't have. And so they go for natural theology, it's called, and that is just implementing human reason and studying nature to come to conclusion of, does God exist or not, and what kind of God is he? So that would be a God made after our own image, really, because our own thinking processes. What we had looked at in the previous series was the spontaneous generation that was denied by Louis Pasteur, because he was a believer. He believed in biblical revelation. but he also proved scientifically that spontaneous generation doesn't work. But Frederick Engels, he said in 18 something, that experiment alone cannot deny that spontaneous generation does not work for those who believe in it. What about today? What about today's science? Do we still believe in spontaneous generation? Well, here's a quote, and we'll get to who made the quote. It's Richard Dawkins, but anyway, he says, "It is often pointed out that chemists have failed in their attempts to duplicate the spontaneous origin of life in the laboratory. The fact is used as if it constituted evidence against the theory that these chemists are trying to test. But actually, one could argue that we should be worried if it turned out to be very easy for the chemists to obtain life spontaneously in a test tube." Stephen Jay Gould, he's saying that we should be worried if it is easy to duplicate. Why would that be? Well, that's where he says, "This is because chemists' experiments last for years, not thousands of millions of years. And because only a handful of chemists, not thousands of millions of chemists, are engaged in doing these experiments. If the spontaneous origin of life turned out to be a probable event, enough event to have occurred during the few man-decades in which chemists have done their experiments, then life should have arisen many times on Earth and many times on planets within radio range of Earth." What's he saying? The spontaneous generation of life is so improbable that it has only happened once. And it's only happened on one place within radio frequency of Earth, of knowledge. So in other words, what he's saying is that it is so improbable that even with all the chemicals, with all the millions, thousands of millions of years, it's only happened once. This is what's interesting or fascinating, in that between the two theories, the creationist and the evolutionist theory, life only happened once. It was created once. It was created by God, or it evolved. How many times? Repeatedly in different spots? No, it evolved only one time in one pond through one scum. So that's, either way, it's a singular event. And the probability of it happening is not very, very high. It's not a very good bet that it happens. So that is Richard Dawkins. What's that mean? Richard Dawkins still believes in spontaneous generation. Today, to maintain a closed system, one must believe in spontaneous generation of life from non-life. So what are these scientists really about? What are they defending? What are they promoting? And that's what we're looking at, is that the name of this series is Culture, Worldview, and Origins. What's that got to do with anything? And why is that important? Well, Richard Dawkins again, he says, "I want to inspire the reader with a vision of our own existence." This is from The Blind Watchmaker. It's the foreword in his book. So I want to inspire the reader with a vision, okay, world vision, of our own existence as, on the face of it, a spine-chilling mystery, and simultaneously to convey the full excitement of the fact that it is a mystery with an elegant solution which is within our grasp. Within our grasp. Humanity. Human reason. More, though, I want to persuade the reader not just that the Darwinian worldview happens to be true, but that it is the only known theory that could in principle solve the mystery of our existence. Worldview, Darwinian worldview. He is not trying to prove that spontaneous generation is true. He assumes it. Why? Because it's part of his system. It's part of his worldview. So what is a Darwinian worldview? What is he trying to convince his readers of a Darwinian worldview? What does that mean? Well, I want to persuade the listener to understand. Okay, this is what I'm writing now. Because you're not a reader. Dawkins was talking to his readers. I'm talking to listeners. I want to persuade the listener to understand what a worldview is, and specifically what a Darwinian worldview is. Okay? We should be out there trying to convince people of the worldview that we have been convinced of. Because that worldview will dictate everything that we do and say, and everything we perceive and how we understand it. So if we have adopted it, then our mission should be to create disciples with the same worldview. And that is what Richard Dawkins' mission is. He is a missionary trying to convince the world that the Darwinian worldview is true and is the only solution to the mystery of life. Okay, again, this is the house. Culture is the Weltbild. That is the underpinning. That is all the influences that make us who we are, how we see things. Then our reliable source of knowledge. We choose that. Out of the reliable source of knowledge, we have basic beliefs. Out of the basic beliefs, we have methods, and then we have resources. That is a whole house of thinking that represents a worldview. So what is the Darwinian worldview? What would be the Darwinian source of reliable knowledge? The foundation. What would be the reliable source of knowledge for a Darwinian worldview? Well, it would be reason. It would be human reason. It would be human logic. Would it be authority? No. They don't give authority to anyone. They don't give it out. They don't look out to the authority. The authority is internal. It's very Western. And so their source of knowledge is logical knowledge. Their source of reliable knowledge is logic, is human. And so it's kind of like, okay, what is your source? Do you agree with that source of logical knowledge? Or are you a Christian that should be going with number 2, the authoritarian knowledge, and studying God's Word, but not studying it, but listening to it and meditating on it to understand how it really happened, what happened. I'm talking about origins. So we're looking at origins. Do you go with logical knowledge for men, or do you go with authoritarian knowledge? That is the worldview. What would the basic beliefs of a Darwinian worldview be? Okay, we have, again, the structure. We have the underlying ground zero, which is the Weltbild, which would be Western, very Western. So what is the source of reliable knowledge? It's human reason, logical processing. Okay, now what would be the 4 rules? Well, it would be the natural elements and the natural processes. And it would be the natural, and it would be supernatural does not exist within the system. Are you in agreement with those rules? That's a Darwinian worldview. Are you agreeing with viewing the world through that picture, through those rules? And I would say I am not. Because, 1, I understand what a Western worldview is, a Western tendency. I understand my source of reliable knowledge. I am not reliable. I, through the biblical record, understand that I have been born with a defect, which is a defect away from God. It's a sin nature that then has been amplified within and over the ages, that my natural inclination is not to submit, nor to receive, but mine is to attack, mine is to go get, mine is to, and so it's kind of like that's Western. And the source, I don't go for a source that tells me what to do. I want to figure it out and do it. And that's Western. So that would be human reason, humanistically centered. But in this case, so that would be a Darwinian worldview. And the rules for thinking, I believe in an open system. And so therefore, natural elements only? No. Natural processes? Only? No. Just a natural world? No. No. My rules are different. So in other words, maybe I should be trying to convince you that my worldview, or the one I have adopted, is more coherent and more actually in line with what's actually out there. So anyway, that is Richard Dawkins' mission. Is not to convince that spontaneous generation is true. That's not going to go anywhere. That's dead in the water. But it's something they have to assume as one of their basic beliefs. And his real mission is to convince you that this whole system, this worldview, you should adopt. Because he believes it's the only one that will solve the mystery of life. This is what this series is about. Understanding how things function and where things are coming and where things are going. How to understand. We're Tim and Holly. You're welcome to communicate with us through the addresses that are there. This is part number 3. And hope to see you in the next one. Thanks for listening.